There are really three reasons why I'm so pleased that Silvan is giving this opening address and that I have the privilege to introduce him. First, as many of you might know, Silvan had a major, decisive impact on my own work on emotion. Second, and more importantly, Silvan has been an extraordinary pioneer when few cared about emotion. His brilliant work in 1962 and 63, Affect, Imagery, and Consciousness, was in large part responsible for reawakening interest in emotion. Now, the third reason is the mark of this man, for he's not just a pioneer to be honored for his past early work. He's a continuing, active scholar and creative thinker and theorist about emotion. I'm going to say a few words about each of these matters in a moment, but first let me give you a brief bit of his biography. Silvan was born in 1911. He received his BA from Penn in 1930 with a concentration in playwriting. And at that time, he wrote a number of plays. He says that he sublimated his interest in playwriting in his current work on script theory. Now, he received his MA in psychology in 1934 from Penn with a concentration in psychophysics, and his PhD in 1934 in philosophy with a concentration on a theory of value, logic, and aesthetics. His PhD thesis was entitled Conscience, Self-Love, and Benevolence in Bishop Butler. He did postdoctoral work at Harvard in 1936 and 37 with Ralph Barton Perry, Whitehead, and Crowell in the theory of value, and with Quine and Schaffer in logic. And then he returned to psychology, working with Robert White and Henry Murray. And one of the many things Silvan did when he was at Harvard was to start a commune for graduate students, which included at that time Brewster Smith, Bob Holt, Lenny Haggard, John Harding, Dalton Vernon, among others. He was an instructor and then a lecturer at Harvard, and then a professor at Princeton for many, many years, before moving to the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and finally a research professor here at Rutgers before he retired. Now, Silvan has received many honors and awards in his career. To name just a few, he was one of those who got a Lifetime Career Investigator Award from NIMH. He was president of Division 8 of APA. He received the Distinguished Contribution Award in Division 12 and the APA Murray Award. He's known for his books on the TAT, on computer simulation of personality, his PAT test, his research on smoking. But let me stop with listing all of these other accomplishments and turn to his work on emotion. Affect, Imagery, and Consciousness, published in 1962 and 63, the 2 volumes, remains a major theoretical contribution. A lone voice in what was then a void, the only other major work published at that time was by Robert Pucek, his book on the emotions in 1962. Now, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with Tomkins, his positions were and remain a challenge to the field. To mention just a few of the topics which he addressed really nearly 30 years ago, he clarified the relationship between emotions, drives, and motives, showing the paramount importance of emotion over drive, and the role of emotions as primary motives in human life. He postulated an affect program which organizes evolved patterns of responses which cut across multiple systems, which he described. He explained the importance of the face in emotion, although I believe many of the facial feedback researchers who followed up on this aspect of his work actually misunderstood it. And he described and explained in some detail a set of discrete basic emotions. Now, if I were to list all of the important topics his theory considered, even as briefly as I have, I would leave him no time for his own talk. But let me at least mention one more thing, which was that in 1964, in an empirical article with McCarter, Silvan reported the very first evidence of very high agreement in the judgment of facial expression. I believe that was one of the things that changed the field of emotion. For Carol Izzard and for me, Silvan's theory and this article changed our lives and our careers. Silvan consulted with each of us independently and crucially influenced our separate but related cross-cultural studies of facial expression. And I don't believe that either Cal or I would have found the evidence of universality without Silvan's contribution to our research and his inspiration. He further collaborated with me in developing our first attempt to actually measure the face, which Phoebe Ellsworth also worked on. And he encouraged Wally Friesen and I to then develop facts, and he encouraged me to develop a theory of deception, emphasizing the role of emotion when people lie. And Cal Izzard's theoretical work, especially in his book, The Face of Emotion, shows a very large depth to Silvan's theory of emotions. Now, I mentioned that Silvan is not just a pioneer who reopened the field and set many of the major theoretical issues alive today. He continues as an active and creative scholar. Volume 3 of Affect, Imagery, and Consciousness on the negative affects is in press, as is Volume 4 on cognition. He is at work on a book on facial affect and another on script theory. He's also working on a script theoretical analysis of marks, which he expects to complete within a year, and is planning a book on value theory within the next 5 years. My fellow emotional researchers, I am delighted to be able to introduce to you Silvan S. Tomkins, who will speak on inverse archaeology, facial affect, as the interfaces of scripts within and between persons.
I'm a little embarrassed. Sounds like a very fine human being he's described. A little strange. But thank you nonetheless. Paul just lifted a great burden from me. It usually takes me the better part of a half an hour to give a few jokes, introduce a paper. And he had told me just last night that we were down to about 45 minutes, and I went in shock. I've never spoken so briefly in my life. My students at Princeton used to have an alarm clock set at 1:30 in the morning for seminars. To bridle me in. But I'm not trying to frighten you. I won't speak that long. Before I begin, I'd like to say that what I'm going to discuss with you is from a forthcoming book, which is co-authored by Lauren Abramson and myself, and I wish to acknowledge my indebtedness to her. The title, Inverse Archaeology, was chosen, of course, for its ambiguity. And it was designed to both illustrate and hopefully validate the conception of facial affect as the interface of scripts within and between persons, since I chose the title to evoke your curiosity, hopefully your excitement, about what it might mean, and by shared excitement, in mutually contagious resonance, invite you to sustained conceptual intimacy for this hour at the very least. Now, archaeology digs deep to bring fossils and artifacts of the past to the surface. Our field, which I've dubbed inverse archaeology, assumes, at least I assume, that the surface of the skin is where it's at, not deep within us. That the skin is the major motivational organ and that a smile is where it appears to be. It's not in a group of happy cortical neurons, nor in the folds of the stomach, but like the pain of torture, the pleasure of sexual seduction, or the irresistible sleepiness at the sight of the eyelids in that region, is the sight of exquisitely sensitive receptors on the surface of the skin, whether we're talking about drives or pain or affect or whatever. The centrality of this organ, this skin, somehow, which is right under our nose, we have failed to properly evaluate. For example, there are at least 250 theories of sleep, which I've reviewed one time or another. Not one of them has considered the fact that a major part of the sleep mechanism is contained in the temperature changes, which I measured at one point, or in this area, which in turn sensitizes the receptors here, which you experience as something which, when you try to cope with it, you try to rub away. That is your sleepiness. It's not some other site. It's right here on your skin. You know it, and yet you will not find it mentioned. Now, I never published this because it took some more equipment than I had at the time. It took a thermograph, and they were very expensive. I had one in the lab, but I couldn't divert its use from affect to sleepiness, interesting as sleepiness was, and is. This conception not only locates motivation on those surfaces where it appears to be, rather than somewhere else, which it represents and expresses. And this conception is thousands of years old, and still alive in Darwin. Look at the title, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. Darwin thought there was something being expressed. What he saw wasn't it. It was expressing something else. That is archaeology. That is not inverse archaeology. It's at once individual and private and social and shared nonverbal communication. We have a great craft union tendency to polarize and to debate things which nature has put together and pull them asunder for analytic experimental purposes. That's fine for many aspects of science. But if you want to understand feeling, you better understand all the things that are conjoined and that have evolved to be conjoined. You can tease them apart, you can factor them, you can centrifuge them, but they remain a unitary phenomenon which exhibits many diverse characteristics at once. Now, that's not fashionable in science. It's called contamination. Unfortunately, we are deeply contaminated creatures. It's not only a shared communication, but is, as in any conversation, which facial affective interaction is, continually shaped and reshaped by dialogic interaction. Our faces are involved in conversing with each other, not simply expressing a private datum. We could not have a conversation if I did not listen to you. Now, sometimes we are given to monologic conversation. It happens. But no conversation could be sustained if that were the rule. Conversation has to be exquisitely sensitive to the impact of the self on the other, and it is in affect as it is in language. Our affects, transformed as they are by our purposes, are continually responding to the affect of the other. Now, it's also at once biologic and innate and learned and transformed. This is no debate whether it's one or another. It is always both, and it has to be. If you respond to me right now with a too quick, too short smile, like so, we will both know that you're displeased at what I'm saying. And how do we know that? Because we know what the innate response is. Both of us know that. So that we can indicate to each other by our deviations from the innate precisely what we mean. If you were to slowly raise your eyebrows, I would not think you were surprised. Because I know what it is to be surprised. They'd shoot right up. But when you raise them slowly, you say to me, "That's a bit much, isn't it? That's not believable. That's too surprising." And again, we understand each other on the basis of our shared knowledge of the differences between what our faces are saying and what they would say if they were authentic. If, however, I don't mean to suggest that everything that is learned on the face is deception and artifice. Far from it. If, for example, one of you in the audience should, right at this point, show me a sustained smile, longer than the innate smile, I would know that what you were trying to tell me was that you were very pleased with what I was saying, and you were very happy, and you wanted me to be very happy, because you would not smile in that way innately, because the program doesn't call for it. To smile and then to hold it, to reassure the other that he has been weighed and found not wanting. That's very reassuring. That's learned. So I don't mean to suggest, as I seem to by the first two examples, that transformation of innate affect has to be inauthentic. It can be different and genuine, because what we know and what we think and what we learn is not inauthentic necessarily. Maybe we may use our face to deceive, to lie, to do whatever, to be opportunistic, to hurt the other, to impress the other. There are endless things we can do with our face because we have endless motives. But nonetheless, a critical part of what we do with our face, even when we pretend, is based on what we know to be innate. And those two should not be polarized and debated as to which one is the more important. They could not exist without each other. If you and I could only engage in transient, programmed affect, we'd be very different kinds of human beings than the kinds of faces that we show to each other, which is based on the full utilization of all of our resources, not simply our affects. Further, in contrast to archaeology, inverse archaeology is not restricted to the past, but rather embeds the present in an extended past and an anticipated future. quite a difference. That's what our faces show. Shows the scenes in our past, in much of our life, and in what we expect it to be in the future. All of that may be revealed at a moment in time. And we decode these reasonably well. We look at a face that is sad and we say, if we see signs of that as an enduring response, how sad it is that he has been sad so much. We see the creases. Or if we see a very happy face, we see how good it is that the world has treated him that well. So it's not just a message, here and now, or the past, or the future. It is all of them in varying ratios at different times. Again, in contrast to archaeology, it is not restricted to the actual, but conjointly communicates ideas and feelings about possibilities, whether of the present, or of the past, or of the future, seen perhaps most clearly in a face in mourning, because mourning is a process of review, of invidious comparison between the present, the past, the future, as it now is and promises to be here on, with the past as it was, the present as it was believed to be, the future as it was believed to be. These complex comparisons of actuality and possibility are continually reflected on the face. All of these things together make for as sharp a contrast as one might imagine between the aims of archaeology and the aims of studying the face. One is a very important thing that we do in reconstructing the past and recovering the past, and I do not wish to denigrate the importance of that sphere of human activity, but it is a far cry from what we do or what we hope to do. Now, facial affect is as important as I think it is. How do we build? I wonder, is there any water? How do we build a cumulative science of such data? What is the facial affective information which should most concern us? Rather fundamental question. And I would suggest we cannot answer that either by looking endlessly at the face itself, or even by deriving it from a more general theory of affect. What will be needed is a non-existent, unified theory of affect as a part of an integrated bio-psycho-social science. Because affects are at once biological, psychological, and sociocultural and historical, this is a very daunting criterion. Since even in biology, the helix and the evolutionary theory are far from constituting an integrated biological theory. What I'm suggesting here is in never, never land. We don't have it in the most highly developed sciences, so why should we look for it? And yet, I'm suggesting that that really needs to be our aim. Now, any science is inherently difficult, and it's especially difficult in the science that we need so peculiar. This is an incredibly ambitious field that we're in. We don't all treat it that way, but it is. Science, in my view, is the fine art of making a mountain out of a molehill. And I mean that very seriously. Even though we do not and can never know with any assurance which molehill will lead to which mountain, facts are never created free and equal. Most of them are casual, even trivial. Some are crucial, and we haven't the vaguest notion, often, which. Even in the quest for gravitation, the fine difference between velocity and acceleration proved to be absolutely crucial. It's a small difference in a way, but it was a major difference. And if that leap could not have been made, there would have been no theory of gravitation. We may restate the matter of molehills into mountains with somewhat more precision by a concept I call information advantage, which I define as the ratio of the simplicity of ordering information to the power of ordered information. Now, I use the concept of ordering as more general than causality because I'm equally concerned with formal systems such as logic, mathematics, as well as physical systems. If I say that x is to the left of y, it does not mean that x causes y or y causes x. It means what it says, that x is to the left of y. To the left of is an ordering principle. And we have to make use of ordering principles in our science in particular, because it's not all like billiard balls. So, doing science, basically, as I see it, is a matter of achieving in the informational domain what the concept of mechanical advantage achieved in the physical domain. In the phenomenon of the lever, you can use small force to move large force. In the concept of the valve in a water distribution system, you can use small force to move large quantities of water. That concept, transferred to the informational domain, yields the concept of informational advantage. Science is not magical, but it does involve two conjoint things going on at the same time. Tremendous compression of information, which is capable of extraordinary expansion. We call that expansion explanation, or prediction, or control, whatever. But it is an extraordinary relationship of using information in a very special way. And we construct that. The epistemic differences between correspondence, coherence, and invention are, like most trade union arguments, in my view, unproductive. We cannot have science which does not correspond to reality. We cannot have science which does not achieve a coherent corpus of propositions, and we cannot do any of this without invention. These are not to be opposed to each other, so that to invent is to be arbitrary, or to be in correspondence with the facts is not to be coherent. These are all different criteria, and they are conjointly realized in this activity that we call science. So as we need less and less information to explicate, predict, control more and more information, we then have increasing informational advantage.